This is a special court that's being set up regarding 6 months ago of the January 6th election. Please listen as we get further into this. Thank you.
Country and the world. The chair of this committee, Benny Thompson, Democrat, Mississippi, now speaking.
January 6th was a violent attack that involved vicious assault on law enforcement. We know there's evidence in a coordinated, planned attack. We know that men and women who stormed the Capitol wanted to derail the peaceful transfer of power in this country. We know that 7 people lost their lives, that more than 140 police officers suffered injuries. We know that efforts to subvert our democracy are ongoing, and a major part of the Select Committee's work will be to find ways to eliminate that threat. We also know that the rioters came dangerously close to succeeding. If not for the heroism of the United States Capitol Police and the Metropolitan Police Department, many more lives might have been lost, and the rioters could have accomplished what they set out to do, upend American democracy. It's an honor to have 4 of these heroes sitting before us today. We welcome them for appearing here, and more importantly, for your heroism on January 6th. You have the gratitude of this committee and this country. You held the line that day. I can't overstate what was on the line, our democracy. You held the line. We're going to revisit some of those moments today, and it won't be easy, but history will remember your names and your actions. And it's important to think about history as this committee starts its work, and as we hear from these courageous men and to get answers for the American people, because we need to understand our history if we want to understand the significance of what happened on January 6th and our role as members of the People's House. I'm talking about the peaceful transfer of power. 200 years ago, in 1801, the House of Representatives did one of its jobs laid out in the Constitution. After a deadlock in the Electoral College, this body cast 36 ballots and ultimately settled the contest for President of the United States. What followed was the first peaceful transfer of power in our country's history. We know that since then, our history has been far from perfect. We've been torn apart and brought back together. We've struggled across generations to make our country's great vision a reality for all Americans. We won victories and we've suffered failures. But the peaceful transfer of power has stood as the pillar of our democracy. It's one of those things we rely on, a safeguard that we hold close, because as heated and angry and divided as we may be, whatever victories we celebrate or upheavals we endure, we can rest easy knowing that when the moment comes, our system guarantees that one party will hand the reins to another if that's the will of the people. And while our institutions endured, and while Joe Biden is the legitimately elected president of the United States, a peaceful transfer of power didn't happen this year. It did not happen. Let that sink in. Think about it. A violent mob was pointed toward the Capitol and told to win a trial by combat. Some descended on this city with clear plans to disrupt our democracy. One rioter said that they weren't there to commit violence, but that, I'm quoting, "we're just there to overthrow the government." I want to repeat that. I urge everyone to listen to those words and think about what they mean. We were just there to overthrow the government. They marched on the Capitol with the clear intentions of stopping the certification of the election. And when they encountered the police sworn to keep us safe, they went on the attack with bear spray, knives, tasers, hockey sticks, even flagpoles fashioned in clubs with the American flag still attached. And those rioters breached the Capitol. They smashed windows, scaled walls, broke down doors, and invaded the halls of Congress. It was a scene of violence in the citadel of our democracy, not seen since 1814, when British soldiers sacked the building. They raced through the hallways chanting, "Hang Mike Pence. Where's Nancy?" They stormed onto the Senate floor because they wanted to stop the Senate from certifying the election. The rioters tried to take over the House floor for the same reason. Thankfully, some astute young staff member had the presence of mind to grab the physical electoral ballots for safekeeping. These rioters were organized. They were ready for a fight, and they came close to succeeding. It's frightening to think about how close we were. A few inches of wood and glass. An officer turning left instead of turning right. But just describing that attack doesn't come close to capturing what actually took place that day. So we're going to see some of what our witnesses saw on January 6th. Let's see the video, please. But please be advised that it contains graphic images and strong language, which many may find disturbing.
Hey brother, we're boots on the ground here. We're moving on to Capitol now. I'll give you a boots on the ground update here in a few.
Multiple Capitol entries! Multiple Capitol entries! We're still taking metal, sharpened objects, missiles to include bottles and rocks, and hand-thrown chemical-grade fireworks. This is now effectively a riot.
1349 hours declaring it a riot.
Okay, guys, apparently this tip of the spear has entered the Capitol building.
If I give this up, they're going to have to run downstairs. At least this Capitol we can defend. We gotta hold what we have. Take your hands off.
Yeah. The fuck?
Take your hands up.
Where the fuck are they?
There's a deputy who tanked. 1033. I repeat, 1033. West from the Capitol. We've been tanked and we've lost the life.
Jimmy, get it to the back. Get to the back. Get to the back. Let's get some fresh faces up front.
They've got the gallows set upside this Capitol building. It's time to start fucking using them.
Start making a list, put all those names down, and we start hunting them down one by one. Mobilize in your own cities, your own counties, storm your own Capitol buildings, and take down every one of these corrupt motherfuckers. Some fucking need to have 30,000 guns.
He'll be back, he warns us. It's just chilling. I thank God for our democracy and our republic withstood this assault. But that man's warning reminds us that this threat hasn't gone away. It looms over our democracy like a dark cloud. Some people are trying to deny what happened, to whitewash it, to turn the insurrectionists into martyrs. But the whole world saw the reality of what happened on January 6th. The hangman's gallows sitting out there on our nation's mall. The flag of that first failed and disgraced rebellion against our union being paraded through the Capitol. The hatred, the bigotry, the violence. And all of it for a vile, vile lie. Let's be clear. The rioters who tried to rob us of our democracy were propelled here by a lie. As chairman of this committee, I will not give that lie any fertile ground. We need to understand how and why the big lie festered. We need to know minute by minute how January 6th unfolded. We need to understand how the rotten lie behind January 6th has continued to spread and feed the forces that would undermine American democracy. And we need to figure out how to fix the damage. It won't be easy, but I have tremendous confidence in the colleagues sitting to my left and right. These are men and women of courage and character. We did not ask for this, but the House of Representatives did its job to give this country its first peaceful transfer of power. And we will do our job now to make sure the peaceful transfer of power remains a pillar of our democracy. We cannot allow ourselves to be undone by liars and cheaters. This is the United States of America. My distinguished colleague from Wyoming, Ms. Cheney, is not the ranking member of this select committee, but because this investigation is bipartisan, it's important that we hear Republican voices as well. I now recognize Representative Cheney for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chairman Thompson. Thank you to all my colleagues on this committee, and thank you to each of the witnesses appearing before us today. It is because of you. You held the line. You defended all of us. You defended the Capitol, and you defended the Constitution and our republic. And every American owes you our undying gratitude. Every American, I hope, will be able to hear your testimony today and will watch the videos. The videos show the unbelievable violence and the inexcusable and intolerable cruelty that you all faced, and people need to know the truth. I want to begin by reflecting briefly on the investigation that we're launching today. Every one of us here on the dais voted for and would have preferred that these matters be investigated by an independent, nonpartisan commission composed of 5 prominent Americans selected by each party and modeled on the 9/11 Commission. Although such a commission was opposed by my own leadership in the House, it overwhelmingly passed with the support of 35 Republican members. It was defeated by Republicans in the Senate. And that leaves us where we are today. We cannot leave the violence of January 6th and its causes uninvestigated. The American people deserve the full and open testimony of every person with knowledge of the planning and preparation for January 6th. We must know what happened here at the Capitol. We must also know what happened every minute of that day in the White House. Every phone call, every conversation, every meeting leading up to, during, and after the attack. Honorable men and women have an obligation to step forward. If those responsible are not held accountable, and if Congress does not act responsibly, this will remain a cancer on our constitutional republic, undermining the peaceful transfer of power at the heart of our democratic system. We will face the threat of more violence in the months to come, and another January 6th every 4 years. I have been a conservative Republican since 1984, when I first voted for Ronald Reagan. I've disagreed sharply on policy and politics with almost every Democratic member of this committee. But in the end, we are one nation under God. The framers of our Constitution recognized the danger of the vicious factionalism of partisan politics. And they knew that our daily arguments could become so fierce that we might lose track of our most important obligation, to defend the rule of law and the freedom of all Americans. That is why our framers compelled each of us to swear a solemn oath to preserve and protect the Constitution. When a threat to our constitutional order arises, as it has here, we are obligated to rise above politics. This investigation must be nonpartisan. While we begin today by taking the public testimony of these 4 heroic men, we must also realize that the task of this committee will require persistence. We must issue and enforce subpoenas promptly. We must get to objective truth. We must overcome the many efforts we are already seeing to cover up and obscure the facts. On January 6th and in the days thereafter, almost all members of my party recognized the events of that day for what they actually were. One Republican, for example, said, quote, "What is happening at the U.S. Capitol right now is unacceptable and un-American. Those participating in lawlessness and violence must be arrested and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. No member of Congress should now attempt to defend the indefensible, obstruct this investigation, or whitewash what happened that day. We must act with honor and duty and in the interest of our nation. America is great because we preserve our democratic institutions at all costs. Until January 6th, we were proof positive for the world that a nation conceived in liberty could long endure. But now January 6th threatens our most sacred legacy. The question for every one of us who serves in Congress, for every elected official across this great nation, indeed for every American, is this: will we adhere to the rule of law? Will we respect the rulings of our courts? Will we preserve the peaceful transition of power? Or will we be so blinded by partisanship that we throw away the miracle of America? Do we hate our political adversaries more than we love our country and revere our Constitution? I pray that that is not the case. I pray that we all remember our children are watching as we carry out this solemn and sacred duty entrusted to us. Our children will know who stood for truth, and they will inherit the nation we hand to them, a republic if we can keep it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I just put out a memo to some of my viewers in regards to this very meeting that is happening today. In my gesture, I made reference to the fact that in their solemn oath to protect the American people, it's also declared that they will be protected as a entity of taking that oath as politicians, to the point that they will not swear to incriminate themselves, because if they do, this would be looked upon as an act of treason. If they abide by their own oath that they have sworn, everybody up there will whitewash this down the tubes, and it will be basically brought before the world as a conflicting emotional event that got too out of hand. Especially whenever you still have a prior president that is telling the American people and the world that the election was stolen, hyping up more emotions, and not responding the way that a political professional politician is supposed to respond in the regards towards unifying the republic. We have somebody out there that is disobeying his own laws in regards towards a running election. And it's one thing to not know what you're doing, but it's another thing to willfully be doing this and continually doing this even as we speak. My gesture to these people is I hope that they do the right thing. I don't expect a lot of them will. There may some of them that will put aside their differences and their political favoritism in the eyes of politics. There'll be some of them that will come clean, but there'll be so many others who know exactly what was leading into January 6th that sat idly by and let it develop, hidden in plain view, right in front of everybody's eyes. It is a shameful act of competency. I want to repeat that. It is a shameful act of competency upon to both parties that sat idly by and allowed for this to boil, to fester, to lead into this type of event. If this event would have been betterly planned and organized, it is a strong possibility that they could have very well taken over the White House towards overthrowing the United States government, which would have been overthrowing the will of the people. Thank God that God was on our side once more again in not allowing for that to elevate into that level to the point that they actually done bodily harm to Mike Pence or to the Speaker of the House, or possibly even took somebody's life willfully in that regard. There was life that was taken that day and later on because of those events. But thank God that it didn't elevate to the point of an all out and out overthrow. Because if it did, it wouldn't have just been an overthrow in the White House, but it would have been an overthrow amongst the will of the people here in the land. And there would have been confusion and debate about who was supposed to be ordering who around, and the next thing you know, the confrontation would have led into a bloody bath or a bloody event that would have basically made the Civil War look like child's play. This is exactly what our adversary wants us to do. Our adversary that has snuck in to the hen house, that is no longer at the gate of the hen house, but has actually got into the hen house, is now bringing destruction to our democracy and our institutions by and large all over this great nation. If we do not awaken before it is too late pertaining to the problems at hand, this will only fester and even become more of a challenge in future elections. I hope and I pray that this will be some sort of resolve, that we will get to the bottom of this towards accountability issues. But when you still have a prior president that is not being accountable for his actions and is still spewing out lie after lie after lie towards still being a representative of the Republican Party because of their own laws that protects them, it is basically out of control. And until they're willing to adjust those laws in accountability issues, that these people will be held accountable the same as regular citizens. They keep talking about wanting to reform the police. Reform the police. Please, let's reform the police. Well, let's start reforming beginning at the house. And then maybe we can reform the police that protects the house. But until we reform the house in some of the laws that they have towards protecting them, it's basically a runaway train. It's a free-for-all. It's out of control. We're $30 trillion in debt. We got problems on every bay. Suicide rates, gun violence, abortions, nudity, people just living their lives like heathens, not abiding by the laws of the land. It has turned into Sodom and Gomorrah right here in America. And until we're willing to acknowledge that and repair that and come to an agreement of that, these horrible mistakes that the American people continue to keep making, I'm just afraid will continue to keep happening until we have finally got enough. And whenever I say we, I'm talking about the tax-paying people of the society of this great nation. I'm not talking about the politicians. I'm talking about the people. It's very obvious that for the past 10, 20, 30 years, the politicians, that a lot of them are still in power. Yes, after that length of time, they're still in power, believe it or not. Why the people continue to keep voting these people in is bewildering to me. But until we have acknowledged that we have been a failure to our own democracy on both sides, and we're willing to readjust our laws according, we are not going to get to the bottom of this as far as accountability issues. We know what spun this off. Everybody sat back and watched it occur, hidden in plain view, right in front of their own eyes. We've seen it gradually intensifying every day, getting louder, getting bolder, getting out of hand. And just like Rudy Giuliani said, of combat, of defeat. The word combat means war. And he openly said that, representing Donald J. Trump. Donald J. Trump is still crawfishing and still not coming to his senses towards acknowledging the wrongs that he has committed upon to the very institution that he was supposed to be protecting. And until that happens, and until that happens, we will still not be at the core. Hopefully, that will occur during this committee hearing of what took place January the 6th, 2021, here in America, pertaining to the Capitol building. That's an institution for we the people.
Thank you, Representative Cheney. I will now introduce our witnesses. We're joined today by Sergeant Aquilino Gonell of the United States Capitol Police. He's a 15-year veteran of the Capitol Police. He's assigned to a first responder unit in the United States Capitol Police's Uniformed Services Bureau. Before joining the Capitol Police, Sergeant Gonell served as 8 years in the United States Army and spent 545 days in Iraq, where his base was under constant mortar, rocket, and indirect fire by insurgents. He's received multiple awards and commendations for his military service. We're also joined by Officer Michael Fanone of the Metropolitan Police Department in Washington, D.C. Officer Fanone began his law enforcement career with the United States Capitol Police shortly after the terrorist attack of 9/11. For nearly 20 years, Officer Fanone has served the citizens of the District of Columbia in special units focusing on narcotics investigation and violent criminals. Officer Daniel Hodges is a member of the Civil Disturbance Unit 42 in the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department, where his responsibilities include riot response. Prior to his service on the Metropolitan Police Department, he served 6 years in the 116th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Battalion, as an indirect fire infantryman. U.S. Capitol Police Officer Harry Dunn is a 13-year veteran of the United States Capitol Police and a member of its first responder unit. His responsibilities include ensuring the integrity of the perimeter around the Capitol building. Officer Dunn has been among the first Capitol Police officers to describe what happened to law enforcement on January 6th. I will now swear in our witnesses. Witnesses will please rise and raise their right hand. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. You may be seated. Let the record reflect the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Without objection, the witness's full statement will be included in the record. I now recognize Sergeant Gonell to summarize his testimony.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Chairman Thompson, members of the Select Committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify regarding the attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021. It is with honor and heavy heart that I come before you to tell you my story from a painful first-hand experience of what happened that terrible day at the Capitol. I'm providing this testimony solely on my personal capacity and not as a representative of the U.S. Capitol. It is imperative that the events of January 6 are fully investigated, and the Congress and the American people know the truth of what actually occurred, and that all those responsible are held accountable, particularly to ensure that a horrific and shameful event in our history never repeats itself. I applaud you for pursuing this objective. Even though there is overwhelming evidence to the contrary, including hours and hours of videos, and photographic coverage. There's a continuous shocking attempt to ignore or try to destroy the truth of what truly happened that day, and to whitewash the facts into something other than what they all mistakenly reveal, an attack on our democracy by a violent domestic extremists and a stain on our history and our moral standing here at home and abroad. As a child in the Dominican Republic, I look up to the United States as the land of opportunity and a place to better myself. And from that moment I landed at JFK in 1992, I have tried to pursue that goal. Thankfully, I achieved that goal on many levels. I was the first in my family to graduate college, join the Army, and become a police officer. On July 23rd, 1999, the day before my 21st birthday, I raised my hand and swore to protect the Constitution of the United States. Because this country gave me an opportunity to become anything that I wanted. At that time, I already started basic training with the Army Reserves. In fact, I raised my hand several times in ceremonies to pledge my commitment to defend and protect the Constitution of the United States. When I joined the Army Reserves, when I was promoted to Sergeant War in the Army, when I was promoted during my naturalization ceremony, and when my reenlistment in the Army, when I joined the United States Capitol Police, and lastly, when I was promoted to Sergeant 3 years ago. I have always taken my oath seriously. On January 6, 2021, I fulfilled my oath once more. This time to defend the United States Capitol and members of Congress carrying out their constitutional duties to certify the results of the November 2020 presidential election. To be honest, I did not recognize my fellow citizens who stormed the Capitol on January 6, or the United States that they claim to represent. When I was 25 years old and then a sergeant in the Army, I had deployed to Iraq for Operation Iraqi Freedom. From time to time, I volunteered to travel on IED-infested roads to conduct supply missions for U.S. and allied forces and local Iraqi population as well. But on January 6, for the first time, I was more afraid to work at the Capitol than my entire deployment to Iraq. In Iraq, we expected armed violence because we were in a war zone, but nothing in my experience in the Army or as a law enforcement officer prepared me for what we confronted on January 6. The verbal assaults and disrespect we endured from the rioters were bad enough. I was falsely accused of betraying my oath, of choosing my paycheck over my loyalty to the U.S. Constitution, even as I defended the very democratic process that protected everyone in the hostile crowd. While I was at the Lower West Terrace at the Capitol, working with my fellow officers to prevent the breach and restore order, the rioters called me a traitor, a disgrace, and shouted that I, an Army veteran and a police officer, should be executed. Some of the rioters had the audacity to tell me there was nothing personal, that they would go through me, through us, police officers, to achieve their goal, as they were breaking metal barriers to use as a weapon against us. Or they use more menacing language. If you shoot us, we all have weapons, we will shoot back. Or we'll get our guns, we outnumber you. They said, join us. I heard specific threats to the lives of Speaker Nancy Pelosi, and then also by Vice President Mike Pence. But the physical violence we experienced was horrific and devastating. My fellow officers and I were punched, kicked, shoved, sprayed with chemical irritants, and even blinded with eye-damaging lasers by a violent mob, who apparently saw us, law enforcement officers, dedicated to ironically protecting them as U.S. citizens, as an impediment to their attempted insurrection. The mob brought weapons to try to accomplish their insurrectionist objectives and use them against us. These weapons included hammers, rebars, knives, baton, and police shields taken by force, as well as bear spray and pepper spray. Some of the rioters wore tactical gear, including bulletproof vests and gas masks. The rioter also forcibly took out batons and shields to use them against us. I was particularly shocked at seeing the insurrectionists violently attack us with the very American flag that they claim to sought to protect. Based on the coordinated tactics we observed and verbal commands we heard, it appears that many of these attackers had law enforcement or military experience. The rioters were vicious and relentless. We found ourselves in a violent battle, desperate to attempt to prevent the breach of the Capitol by the entrance near the inauguration stage. Metropolitan police officers were being pulled into the crowd. We have one right here, right next to me. As we tried to push the rioters back from the breach in the Capitol, in my attempt to assist two MPD officers, I grabbed one by the officer by the back of the collar and pulled him back to the police line. When I tried to help the second officer, I fell on top of some police shields on the ground that were slippery because of pepper spray and bear spray. Rioters immediately began to pull me by my leg, by my shield, by my gear strap on my left shoulder. My survivor's instincts kicked in and I started kicking and punching as I tried in vain to get MPD officer attention behind and above me. But they could not help me because they also were being attacked. I finally was able to hit the rider who was grabbing me with my baton and able to stand. And then I continued to fend off new attackers as they kept rotating and attacking us again and again. What we were subjected that day was like something from a medieval battle. We fought hand to hand, inch by inch, to prevent an invasion of the Capitol by a violent mob intent on subverting our democratic process. My fellow officers and I were committed to not letting any rioters reach the Capitol. It was a prolonged and desperate struggle. The rioters attempted to breach the Capitol were shouting, "Trump, send us. Pick the right side. We want Trump." I vividly heard officers screaming in agony and pain just an arm length from me. I didn't know at that time that was Officer Hodges. He's here today to testify. I too was being crushed by the rioters. I could feel myself losing oxygen and recall thinking to myself, this is how I'm going to die, defending this entrance. Many of the officers fighting alongside me were calling for shields because their shields had been stripped from them by the rioters. I was one of the few officers left with a shield, so I spent the majority of my time at the front of the line. I later find out that my wife and relatives were here in the US and abroad. were frantically calling and texting me from 2 p.m. onward because they were watching the turmoil on television. It was now until 4:26 p.m. after giving CPR to one of the riders who breached the Capitol in an effort to save her life that I finally had a chance to let my own family know that I was alive. After order has been restored at the Capitol, in many hours, I arrived home at nearly 4 a.m. on January 7th. I had to push my wife away from me because she wanted to hug me. And I told her no, because of all the chemical that my uniform had on. Sorry. I couldn't sleep because the chemical reactivated after I took a shower, and my skin was burning. I finally fell asleep 2 hours later, completely physically and mentally exhausted. Yet by 8 o'clock a.m., I was already on my way back to the Capitol. And I continued to work for 15 consecutive days until after the inauguration. I made sure to work despite my injuries because I wanted to continue doing my job and help secure the Capitol complex. More than 6 months later, I'm still trying to recover from my injuries. Many of my fellow Capitol officers, as well as MPD officers, suffer several physical injuries from the violence inflicted on us on January 6th. I sustained injuries on both my hands, my left shoulder, my left calf, and my right foot. I already had undergone bone fusion surgery on my right foot, and I was just told that I need surgery on my left shoulder. I have been on medical and administrative leave for much of the past 6 months, and I expect to need further rehabilitation for possibly more than a year. There are some who express outrage when someone kneels while calling for social justice. Where are those same people expressing the outrage to condemn the violence attack on law enforcement, the Capitol, in our American democracy? I'm still waiting for them. As Americans in the world watch in horror what was happening at the Capitol, we did not receive timely reinforcement and support we needed. In contrast, during the Black Lives Matter protests last year, U.S. Capitol Police had all the support we needed and more. Why the different response? Were it not for the brave members of the MPD and later on from other law enforcement agencies, I'm afraid to think what could have happened on January 6th. I want to publicly thank all the law enforcement agencies that responded to assist that day for their courage and their support. I especially want to thank those Capitol Police officers who responded on their own from home after working midnight shift. Despite being outnumbered, we did our job. Every member of the House of Representatives, senators, and staff member made it home. Sadly, as a result of that day, we lost officers, some really good officers. But we held the line to protect our democratic process, because the alternative would have been a disaster. We are not asking for medals, recognition. We simply want justice and accountability. For most people, January 6th happened for a few hours. But for But for those of us who were in the thick of it, it has not ended. That day continues to be a constant trauma for us literally every day, whether because of our physical or emotional injuries or both. While it has not received much attention, sadly, many of my colleagues have quietly resigned from the Capitol because of that day. I'm also regularly called by law enforcement officials and prosecutors to help identify from photographs and videos the rioters. And to be honest, physical therapy is painful and hard. I could have lost my life that day, not once, but many times. But as soon as I recover from my injuries, I will continue forward and proudly serve my country in the U.S. Capitol Police. As an immigrant to the United States, I'm especially proud to have defended the U.S. Constitution and our democracy on January 6th. I hope that everyone in the position of authority in our country has the courage and conviction to do their part by investigating what happened on that terrible day and why. This investigation is essential to our democracy, and I'm deeply grateful to you for undertaking it. I'm happy to assist as I can and answer any question you may have to the best of my ability. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your riveting testimony.
We want to stop right there. There's no doubt the testimonies that they're going to get from various witnesses and law enforcement agencies are going to be true at heart. And there's no doubt, can't nobody argue or deny the fact that it was a commotion that went on up at the Capitol building that exceeded any other type of commotion since 1814. There's no doubt. There's no arguing. There's no questioning. There's no debate. There's no innuendos towards doubt in any sort of way that occurred. And God bless these officers that stood there boldly enough to take on such of a force, such as a mob that was coming to do what they was doing. They should be treated heroically. The point that I'm trying to make is that in this investigation, if we don't watch, we will deviate from the true factor of where the core of this should lie in regards towards the fault in professional people every day that sit back either through the news or the computers or in live stream, whatever you want to call it, seeing this coming. I don't think nobody thought that it was going to escalate to this level, but they seen it coming. And nobody was smart enough or strong enough or bold enough to sit back and say, you know what, this is all completely out of hand, pertaining to how Donald Trump is revving up the audience, similar towards how Jerry Springer revved up his audience up in Chicago for years. This is all totally unorthodox of how that a politician is supposed to campaign in his campaign tactics, because he's now addressing more of the problems from within his own party and within the parties than he is the interference that's coming from the outside. So politicians, by and large, either Republican or Democrat, should be held accountable, as well as newscasters and commentators that seen this coming. If I'm smart enough, with not a whole lot of education, didn't even get a graduate degree, pertaining to me having to drop out of school because of circumstances, if I'm smart enough to see what occurred and who should actually be accountable, I'm pretty sure everybody else is too as well. Now, there's no doubt we're going to hear some powerful, powerful testimonies, and they're going to be as truthful as hell pertaining to various people that got hurt, crippled, damaged, or destroyed on that day. There's no doubt. But in order for us to take our eye off of that and put our eye off on the area that we should be looking at, we all should be held accountable for what happened January the 6th. I was trying to put out advisory after advisory, warning after warning after warning. You can go back and research my YouTube platforms if you want to during that time, because I haven't erased none of them, not a one that I put out there to the general public. But I guarantee you, before January the 6th and during and after January the 6th, you will hear my comments reflecting the very same thing that I'm saying right now towards going to the very core. Going to the very core of who should be held accountable and responsible for this type of hullabaloo that broke out January the 6th. People seen it festering. People seen it intensifying. People had the feeling that it could possibly occur. But yet, no, there wasn't no red flags that was raised during that time. It was almost treated theatrical, like it was some sort of Broadway play that you would do open live Broadway. It was almost treated into that level up until it actually occurred. Whenever it actually occurred, that's whenever everybody put their hand in front of their mouths and said, "Oh my God, is this really happening? I can't believe it, it's happening." Well, why can't you believe it's happening? You sat there and you watched it fester and intensify and grow. You know that it was in the process. So really and truly, those people, January the 6th, that was led as sheep to the slaughter, was in fact enticed. They was suckered into doing something that in ways some of them probably thought that they was doing a good deed. In ways, there was probably some of them that thought that what they was doing it for the righteous, right, noble cause. Why did they believe that? Because they had somebody on the other end stoking it. Just like Jerry Springer. That would, instead of trying to put the fire out, was actually trying to enlarge the fire. They don't call bodyguards, they don't call people that work in nightclubs coolers because they get involved with an incident that's going on inside the club and they root it on. The primary reason for bouncers of being bouncers is so that whenever they see the first thing happening, the first thing out of line, it doesn't matter if it's male or female, 2 girls, 2 guys, girl and a guy, don't matter. As soon as they see something that is out of the norm, they are trained to immediately engage into that situation and try to put it out. They're called coolers, bouncers, and they're called this for a reason, so that they can help eliminate the problem of escalating even into something greater than what it possibly could. Because how many times have we watched old saloon bar fights back years ago, and cowboy fights, and one person laid into another person, and the next thing you know, the whole thing was involved in nothing but a knockdown, drag out, and they literally destroyed the whole tavern or the whole bar. How many times have we seen that on TV? Again and again and again. Again and again and again. Anybody that's ever watched TV pertaining to old westerns, I know knows exactly what I'm talking about. Well, that's the same way with what was going on in true form in the eyes of the public towards watching Donald Trump steadily revving the people, revving them up until January the 6th. And no, he didn't just come right out and tell everybody to go to the Capitol and lay into them and try to target Mike Pence for him being a traitor and the Speaker of the House. But a lot of times, Donald Trump uses tactics to the point that he don't have to say what he wants people to do. He's crafted that in an art form to the point that he can manipulate people either through fear or through greed of doing what he wants them to do. He is an artist whenever it comes to manipulating the truth and trying to take something and reverse it and make it look like that it's the other person's fault. He's a manipulator artist. Donald Trump is. And he can, I mean, we thought that Bill Clinton was a manipulator towards being able to convince somebody of buying a rotten watermelon and put it in their back seat, and that it would taste good before they ever got it home. We thought that Bill Clinton was good towards manipulating the people. Donald Trump does it twice as good, but Donald Trump don't have no side rails towards which way he's going to go in trying to do that. And he does what he does, I believe, out of meanness. I don't think that his heart's intent has never been to unify the American people. I think as soon as he got in there, he knowed how close that the first and second election was before he ever got to office, and he knowed because of a group of people that becomes almost 50-50 on every election, you know that they're torn down the middle, and because of it, he took advantage of that. And by taking advantage of that, he led the people on. So yes, whenever I use the expression towards what I said this morning in some of my literature, going out to various people, that it was an entrapment tactic. That's exactly what it was. It was the same type of entrapment tactic, but it was being used in more of a social type way versus the same type of tactic that the ATF used against the Davidians down in Waco towards leading them into buying guns that they never should have bought because they didn't pay certain taxes on, which gave the feds the right to put out a warrant to go and shake down the compound. These are tactics. Just so happens ATF used more of a literal tactic of trying to capture about 80 people, to where Donald Trump was using more of a social tactic towards pulling these people in like that, hyping them up, getting them all upset, getting them all wound up. And of course, proof is in the pudding. 6 months later, he's still spewing out the same stuff. Now, somebody told me the other day, in which I looked it up, that Donald Trump had made a statement that if anybody could prove him wrong, that he would give them $5 million. $5 million out of $23 million that he raised right before and during the January 6th election. People was throwing money at him. So $5 million out of $200-something million that you're going to have to sacrifice, or that you put on the line towards acting like that you're going to sacrifice, is really no sacrifice at all, due to the fact that it was given to him to begin with. He didn't rightfully earn it. the way people get out here and earn money with sweat and bra and using their muscles and technique and skill. Oh, he used a skill, all right. But the skill that he used, he should be accountable for by our Congress. But what's more, Congress has to blame themselves for allowing for this monster to grow out of hand, because they was allowing him to get away with certain things while he was president. Even our Tennessee congressman here in the state of Tennessee said that, yes, Donald Trump, what he done to the Ukrainian people was wrong. But it wasn't wrong enough to impeach him or to have him physically removed from office. Well, whenever you steadily reward good by bad behavior, this is what you get. This is the very point that I was trying to make with Tommy Moore, that whenever I moved back to the state of Tennessee in 2014, after David and I continued, my brother that is now dead, whenever we continued to go to court again and again and again and again, and still could not get no heavy discipline hand coming from the courts, we knew that we was on our own. Because basically what Tommy Moore was doing, he was rewarding people with bad behavior. He was rewarding them as the same thing if they was involved in good behavior. And if you let somebody go, it's just like a child. If you tell a child, if you do that again, I'm going to spank you. And if that parent does not spank that child, guess what that child's going to start thinking? Well, I can do this again. And mama and daddy ain't going to spank me. In other words, you'll lose all respect for the parent, because now the parent isn't backing up what the parent said that they was going to do. It works the same way with the law. If the law does not work according to what they're supposed to do, and you're rewarding people for bad behavior, this is what you get. This is what you get. You know, I could sit here and tell you all about Homeland Security, about what they done and what they didn't do down in Madison County, Jackson, Tennessee in 1980 and 80 and 9, whenever the Windmill Ministries first started developing itself back years ago. I could sit here and tell you verbatim, just like that officer did in his testimony, of everything that occurred up in Land Between the Lakes, of how that they was resisting what I was doing, how that they was trying to entrap me, how that they had brought up all kinds of lies and commotions about me up at Land Between the Lakes, to the point that they actually declared me at one time towards a possible terrorist, towards shutting down the Kentucky Dam up around Grand Rivers and Benton, the town of Benton up in western Kentucky. I could sit here and tell you verbatim what one officer done versus another officer towards trying to run me over, towards coming into my campsite, desecrating my campsite, talking down to me, then having me arrested again in 2010, throwing me in front of a federal judge because I'd made a statement about wanting to take out a darkly complected force, an evil force over in Saudi Arabia pertaining to Arabic descent, of being Satan in the flesh. You know, I could go on and on and on telling factual facts about my story, but you're not going to get the basis of it until you go back to the original core, its original origin, which started with 9 tapes that went to the White House in 1988 during the time that Ronald Reagan successfully succeeding in convincing the superpowers that the world was not going to be destroyed by a nuclear holocaust, but it was going to be destroyed by the way that the Bibles predicted for it to be destroyed. The only problem was my people here in America did not support that ideology or that theory. A matter of fact, they've done just the opposite, towards trying to stifle, destroy, mangle, kill the messenger, because they didn't like the message coming from the messenger. That basically was the founder of the Windmill Ministries missions. Now, 30 plus years later, we can see what this has all got them. It's got them distress, agony, and pain. anguish has now fallen to not only into their communities, not only into their nation, not only into their counties, but now a lot of them, it's come home to them to the point that now they're having to deal with peril events that they never would have thought that they would have had to have dealt with back 25, 30 years ago, that they have brought upon to themselves. They have brought this upon to themselves. So as we listen to these testimonies, please do not take your eye off of the ball pertaining to the main core of how this occurred and who was in behind it and how many other politicians, as well as commentators, news commentators, the media, social media, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Angie's List, all of them, how that everybody was involved in watching this unfold right in front of their very eyes, hidden in plain view, and nobody was smart enough to cut it off and to stop it. And they just let it intensify, let the monster turn into whatever the monster is going to turn into. Well, this is what the monster turned into January the 6th. And I had done already pre-predicted that there was going to come a time that our government would have to get out their resources towards rubber bullets and water cannons to be able to stop such as this. And of course that occurred the year prior to that, right there in front of the White House, whenever the military got involved towards supposedly peaceful protest that wound up turning into lethal and deadly protest. So once more, my predictions was right. What I had predicted pertaining to that, and amongst the bloody road ahead, pertaining to all the shootings and the killings, and pertaining to electrical disturbances, all these are predictions that I have made contrary to the position that I felt like that the Father had put me in, based around the fact that there was no one supporting the windmill ministries. And because the consequences was growing, guess what? So will the problems. And they're even going to escalate worse than what they already are until we, the people, decide that we've had enough of this and we're willing to straighten this out. Not just on a social perspective, but also on a spiritual one. Because as the commentator first started, this government was based around "In God We Trust." For all. The invisible God. That's how this government was built, and the builders and the founders of this great nation. Whenever we lose that structure, whenever we lose that concept, whenever we lose that footing, then it's just like Christ said, that if salt loses its potency, that what good is it other than to be trodden down by the foot of man? Well, it got trodden down January the 6th, right in front of everybody. And now this cancer that has unleashed itself before the world is now influencing other countries all over the world towards people standing up and doing the same thing. Now, granted, in some cases, like Honduras, Cuba, Russia, China, other places, I personally believe that the people need to stand up and abolish that leadership or that tyranny that's governed their body. But I also believe that we, the people, need to stand up and recognize towards just exactly where the beginning phases of this core began. There's no doubt people done horrendous, horrible things that day, January the 6th, that need to be punished for their actions. But there's also no doubt that higher leadership than that need to be accountable for their actions too as well, towards allowing it to continue to go on and on and on and fester to the point that it wound up getting this far out of hand.
Sergeant Cannell. I now recognize Officer Fanone to summarize his testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of this committee, for inviting me to provide my eyewitness testimony of the violent assault on our nation's capital on January 6, 2021. My name, for those of you who don't know, is Michael Fanone. And while I've been a sworn officer with the Metropolitan Police Department in Washington, D.C. for almost 2 decades, my law enforcement career actually began here in this building as a United States Capitol Police officer shortly after 9/11. In part because of the 2001 attack on our country by terrorists, I felt called to serve. As a Capitol Police officer, I was proud to protect this institution and dedicated members of Congress and their staff who work hard each day to uphold our American democracy. I remain proud of the work of the United States Capitol Police and MPD officers who literally commit their lives to protecting the safety of each of you and all of us in this room in our nation's capital. After leaving the United States Capitol Police, I became an MPD officer serving the residents of Washington, D.C. I have spent the majority of my nearly 20 years as a Metropolitan Police officer working in special mission units whose responsibilities include the investigation and arrest of narcotics traffickers and violent criminals. I've worked both as an undercover officer and a lead case officer in many of these investigations. In this line of work, it probably won't shock you to know that I've dealt with some dicey situations. I thought I had seen it all, many times over. Yet what I witnessed and experienced on January 6, 2021 was unlike anything I had ever seen, anything I had ever experienced or could have imagined in my country. On that day, I participated in the defense of the United States Capitol from an armed mob of thousands determined to get inside, because I was among the vastly outnumbered group of law enforcement officers protecting the Capitol and the people inside it. I was grabbed, beaten, tased, all while being called a traitor to my country. I was at risk of being stripped of and killed with my own firearm, as I heard chants of kill him with his own gun. I could still hear those words in my head today. Although I regularly deal with risky situations on the job, nowhere in my wildest imagination did I ever expect to be in that situation or sitting here before you talking about it. That experience and its aftermath were something that not even my extensive law enforcement training could prepare me for. I was just one of hundreds of local police who lined up to protect Congress, even though I had not been assigned to do that. Some had asked why we ran to help when we didn't have to. I did that because I simply could not ignore what was happening. Like many other officers, I could not ignore the numerous calls for help coming from the Capitol complex. I'm a plainclothes officer assigned to the 1st District's crime suppression team. But for the first time in nearly a decade, I put on my uniform. When my partner, Jimmy Albright, and I arrived at the Capitol around 3 that afternoon, it was like it was unlike any scene I had ever witnessed. Jimmy parked our police vehicle near the intersection of South Capitol Street and D Street in Southeast, and we walked to the Capitol. From there, passing the Longworth House Office building. It was eerily quiet, and the sidewalks, usually filled with pedestrians, were empty. As we made our way to Independence Avenue, I could see dozens of empty police vehicles that filled the street, police barricades which had been abandoned, and hundreds of angry protesters, many of whom taunted us as we walked towards the Capitol building. Jimmy and I immediately began to search for an area where we could be of most assistance. We made our way through a door on the south side of the Capitol, walking then to the crypt and finally down to the lower West Terrace tunnel. It was there that I observed a police commander struggling to breathe as he dealt with the effects of CS gas that lingered in the air. Then I watched him collect himself, straightened his cap and trench coat adorned with its silver eagles, and returned to the line. That commander was Ramey Kyle of the Metropolitan Police Department, and those images are etched into my memory, never to be forgotten. In the midst of that intense and chaotic scene, Commander Kyle remained cool, calm, and collected as he gave commands to his officers. "Hold the line," he shouted over the roar. Of course, that day, the line was the seat of our American government. Despite the confusion and stress of the situation, observing Ray's leadership, protecting a place I cared so much about, was the most inspirational moment of my life. The bravery he and others showed that day are the best examples of duty, honor, and service. Each of us who carries a badge should bring those core values to our work every day. The fighting in the Lower West Terrace Tunnel was nothing short of brutal. Here I observed approximately 30 police officers standing shoulder to shoulder, maybe 4 or 5 abreast, using the weight of their bodies to hold back the onslaught of violent attackers. Many of these officers were injured, bleeding, and fatigued, but they continued to hold the line. As I don't have to tell the members in this room, the tunnel is a narrow and long hallway. It is not the sort of space anyone would want to be pulled into hand-to-hand combat with an angry mob. Although the narrowness of the hallway provided what was probably the only chance of holding back the crowd from entering your personal offices, the House, and Senate chambers. In an attempt to assist injured officers, Jimmy and I asked them if they needed a break. There were no volunteers. Selflessly, those officers only identified other colleagues who may be in need of assistance. The fighting dragged on. I eventually joined the tactical line at the tunnel's entrance. I can remember looking around and being shocked by the sheer number of people fighting us. As my police body-worn camera shows, thousands upon thousands of people seemingly determined to get past us by any means necessary. At some point during the fighting, I was dragged from the line of officers and into the crowd. I heard someone scream, "I got one!" As I was swarmed by a violent mob, they ripped off my badge. They grabbed and stripped me of my radio. They seized ammunition that was secured to my body. They began to beat me with their fists and with what felt like hard metal objects. At one point, I came face to face with an attacker who repeatedly lunged for me and attempted to remove my firearm. I heard chanting from some in the crowd, "Get his gun," and "Kill him with his own gun." I was aware enough to recognize I was at risk of being stripped of and killed with my own firearm. I was electrocuted again and again and again with a taser. I'm sure I was screaming, but I don't think I could even hear my own voice. My body camera captured the violence of the crowd directed toward me during those very frightening moments. It's an important part of the record for this committee's investigation, for the country's understanding of how I was assaulted and nearly killed as the mob attacked the Capitol that day. And I hope that everyone will be able to watch it. The portions of the video I've seen remain extremely painful for me to watch at times, but it is essential that everyone understands what really happened that tragic day. During those moments, I remember thinking there was a very good chance I would be torn apart or shot to death with my own weapon. I thought of my 4 daughters who might lose their dad. I remain grateful that no member of Congress had to go through the violent assault that I experienced that day. During the assault, I thought about using my firearm on my attackers, but I knew that if I did, I would be quickly overwhelmed. And that in their minds would provide them with the justification for killing me. So I instead decided to appeal to any humanity they might have. I said as loud as I could manage, "I've got kids." Thankfully, some in the crowd stepped in and assisted me. Those few individuals protected me from a crowd and inched me toward the Capitol until my fellow officers could rescue me. I was carried back inside. What happened afterwards is much less vivid. I had been beaten unconscious and remained so for more than 4 minutes. I know that Jimmy helped to evacuate me from the building and drove me to MedStar Washington Hospital Center, despite suffering significant injuries himself. At the hospital, doctors told me that I had suffered a heart attack, and I was later diagnosed with a concussion, a traumatic brain injury, and post-traumatic stress disorder. As my physical injuries gradually subsided and the adrenaline that had stayed with me for weeks waned, I've been left with the psychological trauma and the emotional anxiety of having survived such a horrific event. And my children continue to deal with the trauma of nearly losing their dad that day. What makes the struggle harder and more painful is to know so many of my fellow citizens, including so many of the people I put my life at risk to defend, are downplaying or outright denying what happened. I feel like I went to hell and back to protect them and the people in this room. But too many are now telling me that hell doesn't exist, or that hell actually wasn't that bad. The indifference shown to my colleagues is disgraceful. My law enforcement career prepared me to cope with some of the aspects of this experience. Being an officer, you know your life is at risk whenever you walk out the door, even if you don't expect otherwise law-abiding citizens to take up arms against you. But nothing, truly nothing, has prepared me to address those elected members of our government who continue to deny the events of that day, and in doing so, betray their oath of office. Those very members whose lives, offices, staff members I was fighting so desperately to defend. I agreed to speak here today and have talked publicly about what happened, because I don't think our response to the insurrection should have anything to do with political parties. I know that what my partner Jimmy and I suited up for on January 6th didn't have anything to do with political parties or about politics or what political party any of you public servants belong to. I've worked in this city for 2 decades, and I've never cared about those things, no matter who was in office. All I've ever cared about is protecting you and the public, so you can do your job in service to this country and for those whom you represent. I appreciate your time and attention. I look forward to the committee's investigation, and I am hopeful with your commitment, we as a country will confront the truth of what happened on January 6th and do what is necessary to make sure this institution of our democracy never falls into the hands of a violent and angry mob.
Amen.
We must also recognize the officers who responded that day, many unsolicited, and their countless acts of bravery and selflessness. It has been 202 days since 850 MPD officers responded to the Capitol and helped stop a violent insurrection from taking over this Capitol complex, which almost certainly saved countless members of Congress and their staff from injury and possibly death. The time to fully recognize these officers is now. Thank you again for the opportunity to provide my testimony here today.
Thank you very much for your testimony, and I don't think there's any question you have our commitment that we will do just that as a committee. I now recognize Officer Hodges to summarize his testimony.
Good morning to the committee, members of the press, and to the country. To the members of the committee, I'd like to thank you for your invitation today to provide my account of my knowledge and experiences from January 6th, 2021. As the chairman mentioned, I'm a member of Civil Disturbance Unit 42 and was working in that capacity on the day in question. We started that day at 7:30 a.m., and our assignment at the time was to maintain high visibility along Constitution Avenue, namely the blocks leading up to President's Park, where then President Donald Trump was holding his gathering. My particular station was in front of 1111 Constitution Avenue, where I stood on foot as the crowd poured down the street and into the park. There were a significant number of men dressed in tactical gear attending the gathering, wearing ballistic vests, helmets, goggles, military face masks, backpacks, and without identifiable visible law enforcement or military patches. They appeared to be prepared for much more than listening to politicians speak at a park. Two of my colleagues were approached by a group of 3 to 4 of such men. They were white men in good shape with load-bearing vests equipped with molly pouches. They were wearing BDUs or battle dress uniform pants, tactical boots, black sunglasses, and short haircuts. They had radios, and one was equipped with an earpiece. After a bit of small talk, one of them asked my colleague something to the effect of, "Is this all the manpower you have? Do you really think you're going to be able to stop all these people?" Dumbfounded, my colleague simply expressed they didn't understand what the speaker meant, and the group continued on. As the day went on and speakers in the park said their piece, I monitored the crowd on the radio. Over the radio, I heard our gun recovery unit working constantly, monitoring those in the crowd suspected of carrying firearms, making arrests and seizures when possible. Multiple gun arrests were made from January 5th through the 7th against those attending who likely had attended or planned to attend Donald Trump's gathering. Unfortunately, due to the course of events that day, we will never know exactly how many were carrying firearms and other lethal weapons. I don't know what time it was, but eventually the flow of the foot traffic reversed, with people leaving President's Park and traveling eastbound down Constitution Avenue towards the United States Capitol. At approximately 12:30 p.m., I noticed a commotion about half a block to my east. I saw a crowd starting to coalesce around two figures. I ran to where they were and found a confrontation at the intersection of 10th and Constitution Avenue Northwest. One counter-protester, a black man, was backpedaling away from a white man in a Trump-labeled face mask who was closely following him with an outstretched arm. Myself and my colleague first arrived and physically separated the two, but a crowd of Donald Trump's people had gathered. They attempted to bait the counter-protester into attacking, shouting insults such as, "Your mother's a whore," and accusing him of hiding behind the cops. Eventually, enough MPD members had gathered to move along the crowd, who continued eastbound toward the Capitol building, and the counter-protester departed northbound on 10th Street. Returning to my post, I continued to monitor the radio. I could hear Commander Glover leading the defense efforts at the Capitol as the protesters began their transition from peaceful assembly into terrorism. I became agitated and wished we could move in to support, as I could hear the increasing desperation in the commander's voice. Yet we still had to wait for our orders to change. And eventually they did. At approximately 1:30 p.m., the commander authorized rapid response platoons to deploy their hard gear and respond to the Capitol, including CDU-42. The last thing I remember hearing over the air before departing for the Capitol grounds was confirmation that our explosive ordnance disposal team had discovered a device. Given which unit was being associated with the device, I immediately realized MPD had discovered a bomb of some type near the Capitol. This thought was never far from my mind for the rest of the day. We ran back to our vans and got on our hard gear as quickly as we could. Navigating alternate routes to avoid the foot traffic, we drove as close as we could to the Capitol, disembarking at the northwest side of the Capitol grounds. We gave our gear a final check and marched towards the West Terrace. The crowd was thinner the further out from the Capitol you were. So as we marched, the resistance we initially met was verbal. A man sarcastically yelled, "Here come the boys in blue, so brave." Another called on us to remember your oath. There was plenty of booing. A woman called us stormtroopers. Another woman, who was part of the mob of terrorists laying siege to the Capitol of the United States, shouted traitors. More found appeal in this label and shouted traitors at us as we passed. One man attempted to turn it into a duosyllabic chant. We continued to march. We had been marching in two columns, but as we got closer to the West Terrace, the crowd became so dense that in order to progress, we marched single file, with our hands on the shoulders of the man in front of us in order to avoid separation. However, as we came close to the terrace, our line was divided and we came under attack. A man attempted to rip the baton from my hands, and we wrestled for control. I retained my weapon after I pushed him back. He yelled at me, "You're on the wrong team." Cut off from our leadership, which was at the front of our formation, we huddled up and assessed the threats surrounding us. One man tried and failed to build a rapport with me, shouting, "Are you my brother?" Another takes a different tack, shouting, "You will die on your knees." I was at the front of our group and determined we had to push our way through the crowd in order to join the defense proper. So I began shouting, "Make way!" as I forged ahead, hoping that I'm clearing the path for others behind me to follow. However, as I looked back, I saw that the rest of the group came under attack and were unable to follow. The crowd attempted to physically bar the rest of the platoon from following. I backtracked and started pulling the terrorists off my team from their backpacks and their collars. Around this time, one of the terrorists who had scaled the scaffolding that adorned the Capitol at the time threw something heavy down at me and struck me in the head, disorienting me. I suspect this resulted in the likely concussion I dealt with in the weeks after. Another man attempted to disarm me with my baton, and again, we wrestled for control. He kicked me in my chest as we went to the ground. I was able to retain my baton again, but I ended up on my hands and knees and blind. The medical mask I was wearing at the time to protect myself from the coronavirus was pulled up over my eyes so I couldn't see. I braced myself against the impact of their blows and feared the worst. Thankfully, my platoon had repelled their own attackers and got me back on my feet. The crowd started chanting "USA" at us, and we struck out again for the West Terrace. I led the charge through the midst of crowd control munitions, explosions, and smoke engulfing the area. Terrorists were breaking apart the metal fencing and bike racks into individual pieces, presumably to use as weapons. Thankfully, we made it to the secondary defense line on the West Terrace that MPD and Capitol Police were managing to hold. The rest of my platoon got behind the line, and we could take stock of the situation. I realized that back during the previous assault, someone had stolen my radio. From that point on, I was in the dark as to our current status, when reinforcements would arrive. Terrorists were scaling the scaffolding on both our sides, the tower that was in front of us, and attempting to breach the waist-high metal fencing that was the only barrier we had aside from ourselves. The sea of people was punctuated throughout by flags, mostly variations of American flags and Trump flags. There was Gadsden flags. It was clear the terrorists perceived themselves to be Christians. I saw the Christian flag directly to my front. Another read, "Jesus is my savior, Trump is my president." Another, "Jesus is king." One flag read, "Don't give up the ship." Another had crossed rifles beneath the skull, emblazoned with the pattern of the American flag. To my perpetual confusion, I saw the thin blue line flag, a symbol of support for law enforcement, more than once being carried by the terrorists as they ignored our commands and continued to assault us. The acrid sting of CS gas or tear gas and OC spray, which is mace, hung in the air as the terrorists threw our own CS gas canisters back at us and sprayed us with their own OC. Either they bought themselves or stole from us. Later, I learned at least one of them was spraying us in the face with wasp spray. The terrorists alternated between attempting to break our defenses and shouting at or attempting to convert us. Men alleging to be veterans told us how they had fought for this country and were fighting for it again. One man tried to start a chant of 4 more years. Another shouted, "Do not attack us, we're not Black Lives Matter," as if political affiliation is how we determine when to use force. A man in a QAnon hoodie exclaims, "This is the time to choose which side of history to be on." A man whose shirt read, "God, guns, and Trump" stood behind him, silently holding a Trump flag. A new man came to the front and fixated on me, continually berating me, telling me to take off my gear and give it to him, to show solidarity with we the people, or we're gonna run over you. His voice cracked with the strain and the volume of his threats. He continued, "Do you think your little pea-shooter guns are gonna stop this crowd? No, we're going in that building." Eventually, there was a surge in the crowd. The fence buckled and broke apart, and we were unable to hold the line.
I want to stop right there and cut in right here. You know, whenever you have all these imposters, and that's exactly what it was people that was disguised as being great patriots, great supporters of the United States, but yet now are willing to be led by, I'm going to use the word lunatic, into such of a disgraceful act that turned into a violent mob act. Whenever you have this type of confusion going on, there's no doubt that this was being manipulated by the hand of Satan himself, the spiritual Satan, that's out to kill, steal, and destroy, which is the author of confusion. Christ said that that the Heavenly Father would give people up to a reprobate mind and let them believe a lie and be damned. The very people that was gesturing out that they was Christians are the very people that the Bible talks about as far as being nothing more than disguised devils, imposters, trying to promote themselves as being a good entity, but in reality we see what actually occurred that day. There's both sides of the perspective to look at here, because those who was of a sound mind, adults, which I believe was most, should have known better to have partaken in any type of event like this, and because of it, they should be held accountable and responsible for their actions. But I'm trying to make a point in regard to the spiritual side of this, towards people being reprobates, blasphemers, that confess one thing but do something totally different, contrary to what the Word of God teaches for us to do. This is where we are as a nation, folks. Not just in January 6 affairs, but in just about every other event going on presently or has went on in the past. People that profess to be Christians, but their actions are totally contrary to what a Christian should be. We have been giving over to a reprobate type atmosphere that has helped to create this because of various people working the people, preying on the people, taking advantage of the people, that has now led to this onslaught, this stronghold that occurred January the 6th. And until we are willing to open our eyes and observe not just the outward layer of all of this, but the inward layer of all this, digging down deep to the spirituality side of it, until we're willing to do that and acknowledge this towards what it was, we probably ain't going to get nothing accomplished by these hearings. Especially whenever you have politicians that's protected under the immunity laws, under the immunity clauses that comes along with taking the oath. When you have this type of unsettling balance, you're going to have a formula of a disaster that we're looking at right now that occurred January the 6th that possibly could happen again. That possibly could happen again. So remember this as you're listening to these four gentlemen's testimonies in regards towards what not just they had to battle and bring into the front lines towards trying to overcome, but the vast majority of all of them was doing the same thing. They was fighting. They was trying to hold the line. They was trying to protect various congressmen and senators up in the Capitol building that was going to conduct the rest of the finalization of the election towards getting it authenticated. That's what they didn't want. They didn't want the election to be authenticated. That movement to break that had begun because of the mouthpiece of Donald J. Trump. No questions, no ifs, no ands, no buts. Proof is in the pudding towards what occurred on that horrendous, sad day.
A chaotic melee ensued. Terrorists pushed through the line and engaged us in hand-to-hand combat. Several attempted to knock me over and steal my baton. One latched onto my face and got his thumb in my right eye, attempting to gouge it out. I cried out in pain and managed to shake him off. Before any permanent damage was done. I couldn't fully engage anyone. For the moment I do is when another 20 terrorists move in to attack while my hands are full. It was all we could do to keep ourselves on our feet and continue to fall back. I'm sprayed with a fire extinguisher, and a red smoke grenade burns at our feet. In the fight, a terrorist is knocked to the ground and his jacket rides up, exposing a large hunting knife on his belt. I, along with several other officers, piled on him, while another removed the knife from his person. He regained himself unharmed and shouts indignantly, "What are you doing? What are you guys doing?" At this point, the terrorists had claimed most of the western terrace, cornering myself and other officers on the southern edge. We found a side stair off of the terrace up to an upper landing, followed by more stairs up and inside. Inside the Capitol building, officers walked through the halls briefly until they found a place to sit, decontaminate their faces of OC and CS, and take a quick breather. I followed suit. Someone had managed to find a package of water bottles and was passing them out. I washed off my face as best I could, rinsed out my mouth, and drank the rest. I took the opportunity of relative safety to don my gas mask. Not long afterward, I heard someone calling for officers to move to assist. I steeled myself for another round and descended a stairway into a long hallway filled with smoke and screams. The Capitol building is labyrinthine, but judging from the sound of intense combat, I could tell this hallway led outside to where the terrorists had forced our retreat. Officers were stacked deep, but every so often one would fall back from the front line, nursing an injury or struggling to breathe, and those who remained would take a step forward. It was a battle of inches, with one side pushing the other a few, and then the other side regaining their ground. At the time, I suspect many others in the hallway, did not know that the terrorists had gained entry into the building by breaking in doors and windows elsewhere, so we believed ours to be the last line of defense before the terrorists had true access to the building and to potentially our elected representatives. Eventually, it was my turn in the meat grinder that was the front line. The terrorists had a wall of shields that they had stolen from officers, as well as stolen batons, what other armaments they brought. Even during this intense contest of wills, they tried to convert us to their cult. One man shouted, "We all just want to make our voices heard, and I think you feel the same. I really think you feel the same." All while another man attempts to batter us with a stolen shield. Another man, like many others, didn't seem to appreciate that this wasn't a game. He fought his way across the lawn, up the steps, through the western terrace, all the OC and CS gas, and at the front line of this final threshold was asking us to hold on because he has asthma. The two sides were at a stalemate at a metal door frame that sat in the middle of the hallway. At the front line, I inserted myself so the frame was at my back in an effort to give myself something to brace against and provide additional strength when pushing forward. Unfortunately, soon after I secured this position, the momentum shifted and we lost the ground that got me there. On my left was a man with a clear ride shield stolen during the assault. He slammed it against me and, with all the weight of the bodies pushing behind him, trapped me. My arms were pinned and effectively useless, trapped against either the shield on my left or the door frame on my right. With my posture granting me no functional strength or freedom of movement, I was effectively defenseless and gradually sustaining injury from the increasing pressure of the mob. Directly in front of me, a man seized the opportunity of my vulnerability, grabbed the front of my gas mask, and used it to beat my head against the door. He switched to pulling it off my head, the straps stretching against my skull and straining my neck. He never uttered any words I recognized, but opted instead for guttural screams. I remember him foaming at the mouth. He also put his cell phone in his mouth so that he had both hands free to assault me. Eventually, he succeeded in stripping away my gas mask, and a new rush of exposure to CS and OC spray hit me. The mob of terrorists were coordinating their efforts now, shouting, "Heave! Ho! as they synchronized, pushing their weight forward, crushing me further against the metal door frame. The man in front of me grabbed my baton that I still held in my hands, and in my current state I was unable to retain my weapon. He bashed me in the head and face with it, rupturing my lip and adding additional injury to my skull. At this point, I knew I couldn't sustain much more damage and remain upright. At best, I would collapse and be a liability to my colleagues. At worst, be dragged out into the crowd and lynched. Unable to move or otherwise signal the officers behind me that I needed to fall back, I did the only thing that I could do and screamed for help. Thankfully, my voice was heard over the cacophony of yells and the blaring alarm. The officer closest to me was able to extricate me from my position, and another helped me fall back to the building again. I had found some more water and decontaminated my face as best I could. I don't know how long I waited in the halls for, but soon after I got back on my feet and went to where the fight was again. Until reinforcements arrived, every able body made a difference. Without my gas mask, I was afraid I'd be a liability in the hallway, so I took the exit outside of the upper landing above the West Terrace. I found a police line being held and the terrace encircling us, much like on the West Terrace lower. It was getting later in the day, however, and it appeared we weren't the only ones getting tired. It seemed most of the mob was content to yell rather than try and break our line again. After some time of guarding the upper landing, I saw reinforcements arrive from the south. I'm not sure which law enforcement agency it was, but I turned to them and I started clapping, as it was a sign that badly needed help was starting to finally arrive. Soon after that, I started feeling the effects of the day taking their toll and went back inside to rest. Gradually, all the members of CDU 42 gathered in the room known as the Capitol Crypt. We checked on each other and convalesced, glad to see each other in one piece. Despite our exhaustion, we would have ran out of the fight again should the need have arisen. Thankfully, as the day wore on, more and more resources had arrived at the Capitol to drive off the terrorists. We stayed in the crypt until quite late. And even after we were allowed to leave the grounds, we didn't get to go home. Those who needed immediate medical attention took a van to the local hospital, while the rest of us parked near the city center until the city was deemed secure enough for us to check off. I believe we finally got that message around 1 a.m. the following morning. We drove back to the 4th District and from there went home. Thank you for letting me testify.
I want to weigh in on what these 3 men have just got through talking about here. It appears a great deal of my life, from my adult life, from basically the age of 24, 27, actually 24, it appears that I have had to fight for either my sanity or fight for my innocence pertaining to how various people throughout county, state, and federal governments have tried to either declare me as me being a potential harm, as me being a homegrown terrorist, or just somebody that was basically out of their minds. A lunatic, a madman. I just want the record to show that out of all those people that exhilarated so much attention to the founder of the Windmill Ministries, if they would have exerted some of that energy towards actually going up against the true terrorist, the true people that is trying to destroy the American dream, maybe, just maybe, we wouldn't be facing the consequences of January the 6th of this year towards what we're listening to and looking at. It is so sad. It is a heartbreak in exchange towards the knowledge that I know of what has occurred in my life that apparently to this day nobody gives a damn about. Even my very own biological son. Various friends that I went to school with. my peers, associates, my viewing base, pertaining to, if you want to call them, fans. And I for darn sure hadn't got no help from the law enforcement agencies, either in the state of Tennessee, pertaining to Weakley County, or the state of Kentucky, or the state of Oklahoma, or the state of Georgia. Where we're at in this time of peril, we have to think of various people that was lack in their job and was more concerned towards wanting to destroy the Christian fundamentals of this country than they was towards wanting to attack their own kind, pertaining to the demonic activity that was boiling and led up into January the 6th.
Thank you very much for your testimony. I now recognize Officer Dunn to summarize his testimony.
Chairman Thompson, members of the Select Committee, thank you for the opportunity today to give my account regarding the events of January 6, 2021. From my firsthand experience as a Capitol Police officer, directly involved in those events, and still hurting from what happened that day. I'm providing this testimony solely in my personal capacity and not as a representative of the United States Capitol Police. Before I begin, I'd like to take a moment of my time to ask for a moment of silence for my fallen colleague, Officer Brian Sicknick, who died from injuries he sustained in the line of duty defending the capital of our beloved democracy. Thank you. I reported for duty at the Capitol as usual early on the morning of January 6th. We understood that the vote to certify President Biden's election would be taking place that day, and protests might occur outside the Capitol. But we expected any demonstrations to be peaceful expressions of First Amendment freedoms, just like the scores of demonstrations we had observed for many years. After roll call, I took my overwatch post on the east front of the Capitol, standing on the steps that led up to the Senate chamber. As the morning progressed, I did not see or hear anything that gave me cause for alarm. But around 10:56 a.m., I received a text message from a friend forwarding a screenshot of what appeared to be the potential plan of action, very different from a peaceful demonstration. The screenshot bore the caption, January 6th, Rally Point, Lincoln Park, and said the objective was the Capitol. It said, amongst other things, that Trump has given us marching orders and to keep your guns hidden. It urged people to bring your trauma kits and gas masks, to link up early in the day in 6 to 12-man teams. It indicated there would be time to arm up. Seeing that message caused me concern. To be sure, looking back now, it seemed to foreshadow what happened later. At the time, though, we had not received any threat warnings from our chain of command. I had no independent reason to believe that violence was headed our way. As the morning progressed and the crowd of protesters began to swell on the east side of the Capitol, many displaying Trump flags, the crowd was chanting slogans like, "Stop the steal," and "We want Trump." But demonstration was still being conducted in a peaceful manner. Early that afternoon, Capitol Police Dispatch advised all units over the radio that we had an active 10-100 at the Republican National Committee nearby. 10-100 is police code for a suspicious package, such as a potential bomb. That radio dispatch got my attention, and I started to get more nervous and worried, especially because the crowds on the east front of the Capitol were continuing to grow. Around the same time, I started receiving reports on the radio about large crowd movements around the Capitol, coming from the direction of the ellipse to both the west and east fronts of the Capitol. Then I heard urgent radio calls for additional officers to respond to the west side, and an exclamation, a desperate voice that demonstrators on the west side had breached the fence. Now it was obvious that there was a direct threat to the Capitol. I quickly put on a steel chest plate, which weighs approximately 20 pounds, and carrying my M4 rifle, sprinted around the north side of the Capitol to the West Terrace and the railing of the inaugural stage, where I had a broad view of what was going on. I was stunned by what I saw. And what seemed like a sea of people, Capitol police officers and Metropolitan Police Officers, MPD, were engaged in desperate hand-to-hand fighting with rioters across the West Lawn. Until then, I had never seen anyone physically assault Capitol Police or MPD, let alone witness mass assaults being perpetrated on law enforcement officers. I witnessed the rioters using all kinds of weapons against officers, including flagpoles, metal bike racks that they had torn apart, and various kinds of projectiles. Officers were being bloodied in the fighting. Many were screaming, and many were blinded and coughing from chemical irritants being sprayed in their faces. I gave decontamination aid to as many officers as I could, flushing their eyes with water to dilute the chemical irritants. Soon thereafter, I heard, "Attention all units, the Capitol has been breached," and that rioters were in various places inside the building. At that point, I rushed into the Capitol with another officer, going first to the basement on the Senate side, where I'd heard an MPD officer needed a defibrillator. After returning outside to the West Terrace to assist the officers, I went back into the Capitol and up the stairs towards the crypt. There I saw rioters who had invaded the Capitol carrying a Confederate flag, a red MAGA flag, and a "Don't Tread on Me" flag. I decided to stand my ground there to prevent any rioters from heading down the stairs to the Lower West Terrace entrance, because that's where officers were getting decontamination aid and were particularly vulnerable. At the top of the stairs, I confronted a group of insurrectionists, warning them do not go down those steps. One of them shouted, "Keep moving, patriots." Another displayed what looked like a law enforcement badge and told me, "We're doing this for you." One of the invaders approached me like he was going to try to get past me and head down the stairs. I hit him, knocking him down. After getting relieved by other officers in the crypt, I took off running upstairs towards the speaker's lobby and helped a plainclothes officer who was getting hassled by insurrectionists. Some of them were dressed like members of a militia group, wearing tactical vests, cargo pants, and body armor. I was physically exhausted, and it was hard to breathe and to see because of all the chemical spray in the air. More and more insurrectionists were pouring into the area by the speaker's lobby near the rotunda, and some wearing MAGA hats and shirts that said Trump 2020. I told them to just leave the Capitol, and in response they yelled, "No man, this is our house. President Trump invited us here. We're here to stop the steal. Joe Biden is not the president. Nobody voted for Joe Biden." I'm a law enforcement officer, and I do my best to keep politics out of my job. But in this circumstance, I responded, "Well, I voted for Joe Biden. Does my vote not count? Am I nobody?" That prompted a torrent of racial epithets. One woman in a pink MAGA shirt yelled, "You hear that, guys? this nigger voted for Joe Biden. Then the crowd, perhaps around 20 people, joined in screaming, "Boo, fucking nigger." No one had ever called me a nigger while wearing the uniform of a Capitol Police officer. In the days following the attempted insurrection, other Black officers shared with me their own stories of racial abuse on January 6th. One officer told me he had never, and in his entire 40 years of life, been called a nigger to his face, and that streak ended on January 6th. Yet another Black officer later told me he had been confronted by insurrectionists in the Capitol who told him, "Put your gun down and we'll show you what kind of nigger you really are." To be candid, the rest of the afternoon is a blur. But I know I went throughout the Capitol to assist officers who needed aid and help expel more insurrectionists. In the crypt, I encountered Sergeant Gunnell, who was giving assistance to an unconscious woman who had been in the crowd of rioters on the west side of the Capitol. I helped to carry her to the area of the House Majority Leader's office, where she was administered CPR. As the afternoon wore on, I was completely drained, both physically and emotionally, and in shock and total disbelief over what had happened. Once the building was cleared, I went to the rotunda to recover with other officers and share our experiences from what happened that afternoon. Representative Rodney Davis was there offering support to officers, and when he and I saw each other, he came over and he gave me a big hug. I sat down on a bench in the rotunda with a friend of mine who was also a Black Capitol Police officer and told him about the racial slurs I endured. I became very emotional and began yelling, "How the blank could something like this happen? Is this America?" I began sobbing. Officers came over to console me. Later on January 6th, after order and security had been restored in the Capitol through the hard work and sacrifices of law enforcement, members took the floor of the House to speak out about what had happened that day. Among them was House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, who, along with my fellow officers, I had protected that day and will protect today and tomorrow. I had protected that day and will protect today and tomorrow. And the minority leader, to his great credit, said the following to the House: "The violence, destruction, and chaos we saw earlier was unacceptable, undemocratic, and un-American. It was the saddest day I've ever had serving in this institution," end quote. Members of the Select Committee, the minority leader was absolutely right. How he described what took place in the Capitol. And for those of us in the Capitol Police who serve and revere this institution and who love the Capitol building, it was the saddest day for us as well. More than 6 months later, January 6th still isn't over for me. I've had to avail myself of multiple counseling sessions from the Capitol Police Employee Assistance Program, and I'm now receiving private counseling therapy for the persistent emotional trauma of that day. I've also participated in many peer support programs with fellow law enforcement officers from around the United States. I know so many other officers continue to hurt, both physically and emotionally. I want to take this moment to speak to my fellow officers about the emotions they are continuing to experience from the events of January 6th. There's absolutely nothing wrong with seeking professional counseling. What we went through that day was traumatic, and if you are hurting, please take advantage of the counseling services that are available to us. I also respectfully ask that this select committee review the available resources, the services available to us, and consider whether they are sufficient enough to meet our needs. especially with respect to the amount of leave that we are allowed. In closing, we can never again allow democracy to be put in peril, as it was on January 6th. I thank the members of the Select Committee for your commitment to determine what led to disaster at the Capitol on January 6th, what actually took place that day, and what steps should be taken to prevent such an attack on our democracy from ever happening again.
I want to weigh in real quick as he's ending this up here. One never expects the very enemy from within is the one that you have to be more concerned about rather than international global terrorists on the other side of the pond. You know that ever so often there's going to be a nut job out there. You know ever so often there's going to be somebody out there with a heavy hand that's got a beef against being treated wrongly, or he or she believes that they've been treated wrongly. You know to expect that. But you don't ever expect an all out and out event like this that happened January the 6th, especially here in America, because things like this only happens in third world countries. That's what we thought. Similar towards what I thought whenever I come back to my home place in 2014 and my brother and I realized what we was up against, and we called upon the law, the judicial system here in Weakley County to oblige us. And their own prosecuting attorney here in this county said, I ain't going to do a thing for you, Juby. Being biased towards what that I'd been involved in various places, either in Tennessee, Kentucky, or Oklahoma. That I believe to this day led into what it led into towards the death of a brother. If I had thought for even 1 second that I was going to come back home to this type of resistance and this type of movement, does people really think that I would have wanted to have come back here and been treated, my brother and I, in such of a disrespectful way, not only by the general public that live in this community, but by the judicial system that let us down? It really hurts whenever it comes home to the point that now your enemy is not just the enemy that you thought was domestic. Now your enemy, I mean foreign, but now your enemy has become domestic, of you having to deal with people right here in the USA that is turned against you because of the way that you believe. And that in and of itself is an unconstitutional factor towards denying me my rights towards what I believe and what I have the right to believe in. I truly believe that I would have been welcomed more so in the Northwest Tennessee area in Weakley County and Obion County. Instead of putting up a Christian symbol such as the Star of David, the six-pointed star, I would have been welcomed if I would have been a follower of an occult and put up some other type of flag or some other type of symbol. I would have been more welcomed in the area by not just those that was initiating the problems here up onto our lives, but those that was watching, observing, laughing, being entertained by what was going on here at 291 Thompson Road, Sharon, Tennessee, zip code 38255. In a way, part of me says the American government got what it had coming because of the way that it has treated this ministry going all the way back to 1989. Actually, going all the way back to 1983. It got what it had coming. But in another way, because of my Christianity love, the best that I can do at this point in time is to pity. Pity those around me. Pity those that's resisted against this ministry. Pity those that could have helped but chose not to. Pity those who have laughed in entertainment of knowing what was going on that chose not to do nothing about. Pity them. Because I know that one day there will be a reckoning. Whenever we all stand in front of that final judgment day. And God looks down upon to us and asks us, how come you done what you done? Or how come you didn't do what you know you should have done? And those that have conspired towards wanting to destroy the founder of the Windmill Ministries, beginning at the top, going all the way down to the bottom, will give an account to the Creator towards what they either done or what they should have done, all in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ of Nazareth. These are my final words as this officer is ending up his testimony. I want to say personally, I pray for those who have been wounded, injured, physically, psychologically, emotionally in this ordeal. An ordeal that wasn't supposed to have occurred here in the USA, but did. My deepest, deepest empathy and sympathy goes out to all of those who have been battered, bruised, hurt, taken advantage of, let down by this event.
I also want to thank and acknowledge my brothers and sisters in blue who fought alongside me on January 6th to protect our democracy. Each of you is a hero, and it is my honor to serve with you each and every day. I'd like to thank the American people for all of the support that they have provided these past several months to me and my fellow officers. Lastly, to the rioters, the insurrectionists, and the terrorists of that day, democracy went on that night and still continues to exist today.
Amen.
Democracy is bigger than any one person,
amen,
and any one party. You all tried to disrupt democracy that day, and you all failed.
Amen.
Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I would be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. I thank all the witnesses for their testimony. The rules we established allowed you the opportunity to tell your story. There's no question about it. You've done it in your own words. We appreciate it. And so what we will do now is begin our questioning of you. I now recognize myself for questions. At the time of the attack on the Capitol, I was in the gallery observing the proceedings on the House floor. While members of Congress were being protected by the police, you, the patriots protecting the Capitol and our very democracy, were being attacked by the mob outside. I want to learn more about what you did and what you witnessed. Officer known as a narcotics officer, you weren't supposed to be at the Capitol on January 6th, is that right?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
What prompted you to come to the Capitol?
I was listening to the radio transmissions, specifically those coming from now Commander Robert Glover, who was the on-scene commander If you've listened to those transmissions, he identifies himself as Cruiser 50. I heard things that I'd never heard before in my law enforcement career. In addition to the numerous distress calls or 1033s that I heard, which are, while not commonplace, also not uncommon in policing. I heard things like, the declaration of a citywide 1033, which in my career, to my recollection, has only been utilized in addition to the 9/11 attacks on the Navy Yard attack. And so I found that particularly distressful. Also, you could hear the tone of the individual officers' voices. They were scared. They were, clearly outnumbered and being violently assaulted.
Thank you. So basically, the radio traffic, the 1033 signal on the radio, and your basic law enforcement instincts say.
I'm going to end it right there pertaining to my viewing base. It's going to be long and lengthy. They're going to bring up certain facts. Once more, good luck to all of us. God bless America, and God bless those who are fighting for a more divine, righteous way in a perfect peace that we can all endure before the end of time. As we end our program, we'll end it again by saying shalom. Shalom, 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 which in Hebrew means peace. This was a sad day. This was a day that I believe that could have been prevented. But because of various politicians that gived up the people, that preyed upon to the people, and I'm talking about praying as in P-R-E-D, not P-R-A-D, preyed on the people to get them all excited, to get them all in a hither, that we have various politicians that led these people as leading sheep to the slaughter, that should be held accountable to the fullest extent of the law. But better than that, all of us, starting at Congress and Senate, and those politicians as well as commentators that work for various medias, should give an account too, because everybody's seen it boiling. Everybody's seen it going to its fullest potential or its peak. And nobody was willing to raise a red flag in trying to stop it. Nobody wanted to speak up against the great leader, Donald J. Trump, because they was frightened that it was going to affect their viewing base or affect their voting base. There has to be a time that we as a society put aside our political views and focus upon what is rightfully right as far as the Good Samaritan, under the Good Samaritan laws, versus what is politically right. I want to thank you again, and good luck to all. Shalom.